Hello and welcome to the Global Fleet Voices video series produced by Automotive Fleet magazine, which is designed to put a spotlight on key leaders in today's fleet management industry and to identify the trends that will be impacting our businesses tomorrow. And today I have the honor to have a second interview with Phil Nothard, Insight and Strategy Director for Cox Automotive International. And today we're going to be discussing the areas of electrification and remarketing. So with that, I'd like to thank you, Phil, for joining us.
Hi, Mike. Thanks for having me back on. Yeah, another big subject of electrification to follow on from our conversation around semiconductors. And there's a connection there, isn't there? Pardon the pun, but there's a definite connection between the two there.
Well, get into it. What is the electrification market going like in the UK? I know it's going gangbusters. You had some sales records just set recently last month in September.
Yeah, exactly. I think September is a key point, and I mean we in our last chat we talked about obviously the challenges around supply and being caused by the raw materials. I think some of that has actually accelerated the EV transition and volume towards EV because of the shortage of alternative vehicles. But if you look at September as a whole, I mean, the EV sector grew. I mean, that battery electric market basically year to date has gone up to 9.5% of market share compared to 4.5% at the same period last year. And in September alone, it went up to 15.2%. And that was for battery electric vehicles, so the pure plug-in battery electric vehicles. And I bet you can't guess what vehicle was at number one most registered vehicle in September.
I could take a wild guess, but I don't want to be anticlimactic. Go ahead. Go for it.
The Tesla 3.
Yep.
So an American,
amazing,
in many ways,
amazing story.
An electric, yeah, and it resulted in those listeners that may have a view on the UK automotive sector, but we think about the top 10 most registered vehicles that always has things like the BMW 3 Series, the VW Golf, the Vauxhall Corsa. The Vauxhall Corsa registered 5,235, and the Tesla 3 alone registered 6,879 vehicles in September. Now, if that doesn't tell you the way the direction of the market is heading, I think nothing will.
Well, and also I think it speaks volumes to the power of brand. Tesla has a very strong brand, and that's helping to propel a lot of their sales in the EV marketplace.
No, definitely. I think comparing to what's happening over in the US, and I know that there's been a bit of a shift towards the focus on electrification in the US. Maybe not as much as being in California, but definitely across the US there's been a move. But in the UK, there's still a long way to go. I mean, obviously, the UK, we've got a deadline of 2030 and 2035 for a full move to electrification. I think the view is that it's moving a lot quicker than that. I think 2025 will be an inflection point here in the UK, definitely. But there's a lot to do around the infrastructure, a lot to do with the charging infrastructure.
Well, a lot of what, in my understanding of the UK market, a lot of what's stimulating EV sales is your tax regimen. And the tax regimen is encouraging the purchase of those types of vehicles. But you're encountering the same kind of issues that we have. Infrastructure, and correct me if I'm wrong, but somebody had told me that close to half the homes in the UK only have curbside parking, which puts an impediment to doing home charging, or at least it complicates home charging. Is that a correct assessment?
It is. Yeah, I think you're right. I think that, if you think about the UK, if you look at some of the stats, there's 1,000 on-street charging points outside of London, and against a total of 5,700 in total. So only 1,000 are outside of London itself. Only 25% of UK drivers don't have a driveway out of 8 million. So 25% of 8 million don't have a driveway. So they don't have that facility for having that charging unit at home. And if you look at the motorway network in the UK, there's 500 charge points installed at motorway service stations out of a potential 2,300 needed. So there's a long way to go towards being able to give that full UK-wide infrastructure for the automotive EV driver.
True. And what's your forecast in terms of the fleet marketplace, in terms of electrification? There, it seems like that's a lot more promising versus, the general consumer market, because a lot of those vehicles will be, centrally maintained, centrally garaged, depot type operation that would lend itself to the establishment of a centralized charging system, an overnight
Yeah.
charging.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that is, as you said right at the start there, around the taxation and initiatives. There's a lot of taxation initiatives for the fleet, the company car driver in the UK. It does benefit them in terms of tax incentives for driving an electric vehicle, and from a fleet operator as well. There's a big shift towards that, running 100% fleet of EVs in the UK. And I think, as we touched on in the last show around shortage of supply of vehicles, by 2025, the choice of vehicles for non-battery electric or non-hybrid vehicle in the UK from the manufacturers will be very small. So that, the fleets will have to move and transition towards those electric vehicles if they want to put on a choice of vehicles.
Right. Yeah, I think and those are critical dates, 2025, 2030, and so on, because at that point, you're going to start having a sizable number of EVs come out of service, go into the wholesale used vehicle market. And, it's really critical that there be a robust market for used EVs in order for this to perpetuate itself and be successful in the marketplace.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, that's something we as a business are very much focused on. I think generally, if you speak to any of the OEMs within that remarketing space, or any fleet operators within that remarketing space, the key is getting that used focus on electric vehicles. The manufacturers will do the job in the new vehicle space, whether that's cars in the UK, trucks in the US, etc. Manufacturers, the OEMs, will do the job for the marketing to the consumer, and the tax will be taken care of in terms of initiatives. The challenge will be is actually getting that used vehicle buyer having the confidence to go into a showroom, dealership, etc., to a fleet operator and take a used electric vehicle and understand the market and the ownership of that vehicle as well.
Otherwise, you're not going to have, to use a cliche, you're not going to have an ecosystem for EVs if you don't have a strong used vehicle marketplace there for it.
Yeah, you're right. I think if you can't, you look at the forecast figures, I think, the UK, they're forecasting some significant growth. I think even by 2022, they're forecasting a 28.4% share of battery electric vehicles as part of the market. I think when you look at the global market, by 2040, I'm just looking at some stats here, 54.9 million are the forecast figures for 2040 for electric vehicles. Well, right. That's a lot of used electric vehicles coming to the market before then that need remarketing, selling, putting through that remarketing channels, through the fleet channels into the sector. So there's a lot to do before that point.
Well, I think we're doing a really good job in terms of promoting and selling new EVs. And I'm convinced that everything we produce in the next 5 years is going to be sold. I think where we're really being laggards in a bit is on the remarketing side. I can only speak about the American market, but there's only a handful of auctions that I know that actually have recharging facilities at their sales. Unless you can recharge a used vehicle at an auction, it's going to be, chaotic. There's a lot of catch up that needs to be done. And I think a lot of people are going to be surprised as the expense in putting that in.
Yeah, and I think if you look at the Cox Automotive, whether that's across the international global market in the US or just in the UK through sort of Mannheim in the US, there, a lot of the investment is around that charging infrastructure at the auctions. You've seen our recent acquisition as well of Spires Technology. There's a lot of investment, and as you say there, it's not just the charging, it's the appraisal, inspection of those electric vehicles, the movement of those electric vehicles, the description of those electric vehicles. And that's before me and you even start to talk about that degradation of a battery, of how do you appraise that and how do you manage that in the used vehicle space to the used car buyers in the wholesale marketplace.
I think we're fixated on selling new EVs, and there's not enough discussion and not a lot of thought, or the thought is coming late in terms of how you're going to be remarketing these EVs and how you're going to create a vibrant used EV marketplace. But with that, Phil, our time's gone by again.
Again.
We barely touched upon remarketing. We'll have to pick that up next time. Thank you very much for joining us. I appreciate it.
You're very much welcome. I suspect there'll be many more of these conversations to come.